today, we have a situation where coming out of the neoliberal period, unipolar period, when US and European Union also basically followed the same path, same prescriptions, and even UNDP at the United Nations. So they were all pushing this neoliberal line, and they were claiming that this would, as you put it so nicely, lead to great industrial, agricultural, and overall development. It really hasn't happened in many places. In fact, it led to crisis in many parts of the global South, starting with Central and South America, starting with Mexico, the so-called debt crisis of 1980s, which gave these organizations and northern states to push even further their neoliberal program. But now I think there is an opening with this BRICS, the multipolar world that is developing. And to go back to your original question, I think it is a major shift. It could be derailed, but I don't think it's going to go down without a serious struggle. And I think there is a good chance that the multipolar system might prevail.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today by Haider A. Khan, a professor of international and development economics at the University of Denver. Professor Khan was born in Dhaka, at the time East Pakistan, today that's Bangladesh. He then became an academic and a policy advisor, being the chief international advisor to Arab trade and human development in Cairo, and a senior economic advisor to the Secretary General of UNCTAD in Geneva, and several government and international organizations. He has published 25 books and over 200 articles in professional journals, and he's a poet and art critic too. Haider Khan, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for your kind invitation.
So you're a development economist, and
Indeed.
From my experience, broadly speaking, there's kind of two types of development economists. One being these thoroughly like neocon side of the game, who would basically sell their grandmother for more liberalization in developing countries. And then there are the more lefty kind of Marxist-inspired types like 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁𝘁 or Amartya Sen. And is it fair to say that you probably belong to the second group?
Yes, actually, I'm an avid student of Professor Sen. I have spent a lot of time with him. Online, you can find an interview I did of him. He is definitely one of my mentors. And then Erik Thorbecke, who was a student of Jan Tinbergen, I think the first ever Nobel Prize winner from the Netherlands, a very, very humanist, socialist type of economy, democratic socialist type of social thinker and economist. And I've also been influenced by Gunnar Myrdal, the great Swedish political economist, also a Nobel Prize winner. I think I have read the other side too. So I'm informed about the other side. I speak of what I know of them as well. So I think I can be fair.
Okay, and then I mean, because we would like to talk today, especially about developing countries and about what's going on in terms of their economics at the moment. Maybe we get to talk a little bit about Pakistan later, but at the moment, let me start maybe with your personal development. You were born and raised in Dhaka, and then now you're in Denver. Can you tell me, like, what was your path to academics?
It's a long journey, but I can make it short. I was a student of physical science, actually, when I was growing up, as well as interested in literature and music. I had a really good childhood and good adolescence. But by the time I was in 4th or 5th grade, already there was a lot of turbulence in then East Pakistan. Students in particular were revolting against the military dictatorship, very courageous ones. In fact, I have a book that in English that just came out last year where I have described all these things. My own interest in society and social science grew by leaps and bounds when the movement for autonomy of East Pakistan and other parts of what was then called West Pakistan became very strong, led by dissident politicians and by students, but they also merged with movements and demands for social justice by workers and by peasants who are horribly exploited and still are to a large extent, I'm sorry to say. But that was a time of awakening for people like me. And that started me on the road to thinking about society seriously. And then after the War of Liberation in Bangladesh, I realized that inequalities of all sorts, starting with economic inequalities, but not stopping there, were at the root of these kind of problems. And so I thought that I should study economics along with physics and mathematics, which I always have loved, I still love. And I studied music and literature too. And I had this opportunity to come to the US through a program called World Youth Forum. I met many young men and women from many different countries. Many of them were very progressive and still remain so, especially the ones from the global South, as well as Europeans. Especially my German friend, 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘆, and my Italian friend, 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘆, who actually just retired from his career in trade union movement. So that was a transformative experience for me, for all of us, I think. And that led me to study economics more seriously. And then when I came to graduate school at Cornell, I met 𝗦𝘁𝘂𝗱𝗶𝘁𝘆, of course, whose name I have mentioned, but I also met other progressive thinkers. And we had to organize, however, our own study groups to study dissident economics. So that was one thing that I think launched us towards even more independent thinking for ourselves and organizing for ourselves. I also got involved in student and labor movement in the US, even when I was a student. And then later Sen came to as a visiting professor at Cornell. And that was my first live encounter with him, although I had read much of what he had written until then earlier. And I thought through them, or tried to think through them productively and critically. So we had long discussions on everything. And that continues till today.
So, and if we now talk about the big picture of development and the world politics, and I know that you're also one of the people studying not only geopolitics but geoeconomics, right? That's a part of your work. So if we look at how things have been changing over the last 1 year with the war, the Russia-Ukrainian war, but also with the tremendous development that went on with the BRICS nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the de-dollarization of large parts, or attempted de-dollarization of large parts of the non-Western countries. How do you evaluate what's currently happening? Is it a huge step, or is it going to be just another small step towards a multipolar world? How do you see things?
Okay, no, that's a very deep and complex question, or a set of questions. They are all connected, of course. I think one reason I always started to think broadly, or I tried to think broadly, or I was attracted towards thinking broadly, was because of the war itself in Bangladesh, in East Pakistan then, War of Liberation, as we call it. And I think economic and social problems, as well as what we might call more narrowly cultural issues, issues of language, issues of religion, and other things. Those are also connected. And I think if we start at a broad enough level, we can see that we have to understand geopolitics and geoeconomics. Geopolitics in a critical sense, not in the sense of empire building people like Halford Mackinder and the Germans, who thought about geopolitics from an imperialist point of view, or would-be imperialist point of view during the earlier part of the 20th century. I think you cannot of course, deny your geographical location. But geography itself is politically defined. It's not just something on a map. So I would say there is a history of nation formation. Of course, being from Germany, you would know that better than most people. The whole process of German nation building, even the debate between Kleindeutsch and Grossdeutsch supporting people, and all that. Italian unification has a similar story, but details, of course, are important. So given that we have the ideology and politics of modern nation state and state building, which isn't innocent at all internally, and certainly externally, we have to admit that given that these are class-driven societies, and that there's a striving by the ruling class to be dominant, or at least to be secure enough from other countries' encroachments. So this essentially leads to a kind of slant on economic development that leans increasingly towards fulfilling the needs of state building and the needs of the ruling classes themselves. And they vary. Some are more ambitious than others, clearly. But the entire history of modern Europe, certainly, and modern West or North, as one might wish to call, including North America, Canada and US, certainly. We see that great power rivalry becomes a fact of life. And that is much more complicated than Mackinder's categorization. So we have to see geopolitics from above, even in this nuanced historical way, and then we have to see it from below as whose interests it really serves historically, and whose interest is it serving right now. And there have been many anti-war poets, good anti-war poets. Brecht has a very famous poem where he talks about the general, who is bragging about his tanks and his army, but the citizen asks, but you cannot do it all by machines. Human beings are needed, and are the human beings always going to obey you? Are they always going to follow you? I think that is the critical spirit. The spirit of revolt also exists there. And we can come to geoeconomics perhaps after this.
Yes, I just want to interject that we are witnessing a moment in time when geopolitics or occurrences in international politics mimics art. we've had a very famous German singer in the 1990s who sang 99 red balloons that were the reason for nuclear war. And in February, we got very close with balloon mania in the United States, right?
Yes.
It's funny sometimes how artists are able to predict the future. I always thought that was just a song. It turned out to be a prediction. But if we take that into today's world again, like in 2023, how do you see development economics changing and the current power balance changing? I mean, take the geoeconomics that you want to talk about.
Okay, yeah, excellent. Life indeed sometimes imitates art. And I think geoeconomics, of course, looks at economics more politically. You can even say geopolitically, but I would say both internally and externally. Sometimes people look at geoeconomics only from the realist lens. And that is a good starting point, I think, because we have to acknowledge that there is a structure. Some people call it anarchy, but it's a little more complicated than just pure anarchy. But there is a structure in the international relations where, as Mearsheimer puts it, self-help is necessary quite often. But that's not all of it. There is internal politics and internal economics. So economic development, as I was alluding to before, quite often is driven by those national, so-called national interest defined by internal debates, taking external factors into account. And one example is Franz Liszt from Germany, actually, who came to the US, learned about protectionism here, then went back to Germany. And he was basically a German nationalist. In fact, he introduced the term national economy in the vocabulary of economists. So I would, in a way, put him as one of the pioneers of geoeconomics in this sense. And there we have both the economic structure, the different parts of the economy, which are interlinked. And as the economy becomes more productive, in Marxian terms, as productive forces develop, as innovation takes place, then you have even closer connections between different parts of the economy. And of necessity, as Marx famously points out in his Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, they wrote it together, that this bourgeois society breaks down all the Chinese walls, right? And you can no longer be isolated from the world economy. And there again, the game for dominance becomes important, but this game for dominance is conditioned by both external factors and internal factors. But then we have to go beyond that, because my own view is that one has to look at this, sometimes this is called defensive realism or neoclassical realism. And I say that we have to transcend this one because we have another vision for people-oriented economy and people-oriented future and people-oriented politics. So I call my view critical trans-neoclassical realism. So realism is there. I think we have to admit that. But it's not the final comment, or it's not the final destination for us. Certainly, if we value peace, we have to think about a world which is beyond this kind of rivalry.
So, I mean, when we look at how the economy worked for at least the last 30 years, right? We've had the United States that was shouting at the top of its lungs that all the developing nations should open their markets, absolute liberalization, no trades, no tariffs, no barriers, which of course, in all the countries that heeded that call, led to the absolute exploitation of their natural mineral wealth, while any kind of development of local industries was stifled. Like, there was no development at all. And there's famous books on, how the US and the West developed precisely because they protected core industries. And if you look at success cases in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, they protected their core industries and had this stellar rise. Now that's why this globalization, the idea of globalization is a sugar-coated term for exploitation of developing nations that are supposed and sometimes forbidden by the IMF, by the World Bank, from actually using tariffs. And now the same United States and the same West is starting to put very, very harsh tariff barriers and sanctions and so on. You know, it's basically the opposite of the previous approach, but now they do that under the guise of national security, right? We are seeing a inversing of the previous dogma. How does that make sense, or how do you make sense out of this huge change?
It's really fascinating. If we look at it historically again, starting in 1790, when Alexander Hamilton wrote his famous report on manufactures, basically arguing US should be a protectionist economy. As I said, Franz Liszt actually learned about this strategy from the Americans of that time. And up until the end of the Second World War, US was definitely a very protectionist country. But there was thinking about free trade, which would benefit the US. And of course, there were already theories that argued it would benefit everybody, and they came in handy as well. One of my mentors in America was a great scholar named Professor Warren Hickman. And Professor Hickman both served in the Second World War in actually Eisenhower's headquarters. And then he went to study in Geneva, that famous school of international studies in Geneva. He wrote his dissertation under Wilhelm Röpke, I think is his last name, very famous conservative, classical liberal, actually, they would call themselves, free trade kind of person. And his dissertation was about how US internal politics veered increasingly towards free trade that ultimately actually benefited the US. And you could argue at that time that it benefited Europe, for example, if no other place. From the time US basically took away the mantle of empire from the British, we can date it precisely to Suez Canal crisis in 1956. I think US basically had the rhetoric of helping others and set up agencies like USAID. But its interest basically was dictated by Cold War imperatives, rivalry against the USSR. And as Mearsheimer correctly points out, there were actually two bounded orders at that time, bounded in the sense that they were not international orders. One by the US, and the other one was by the Warsaw Pact, including Warsaw Pact countries led by or dominated by USSR at that time. And the two were definitely rivals. The entire history of Cold War, of course, is more complicated. There were also kind of forced cooperation when both sides realized that mutual destruction through nuclear war is a real possibility. But we can leave that aside for the time being and focus on the economic side. So what really happened was that at most you could have light industrial development. But still, as people like Raoul Prebisch and others who were instrumental in founding of UNCTAD in Geneva, where I worked for some time, pointed out that the trade itself was unequal. And we need really the right kind of trade from the South and not this so-called aid. In my own work, I have also shown how aid leads to dependency. I'm not the only one, of course, and how much of the aid basically is misallocated, and very little of it actually bears the kind of fruits that people in developing countries, so-called, really want and need. So I think it will be, on the whole, correct to say that aid and the kind of international division of labor that was developed, even during the so-called golden age of post-war capitalism, up until, say, mid-70s, basically created dependency. And that Latin American critical thinkers, to their credit, noticed it quite early on, and they formed the whole Dependency school of thinking. And then world systems theorists, people like Emanuel Wallerstein and others, basically formed a more historically and or globally oriented approach in world systems theory approach. And in my own thinking, I have followed basically these tendencies, trying to make them more specific, and because I come from a background in physics and mathematics, also trying to make wherever possible more precise and sometimes formal, but I don't think that is a necessity. We need to understand the political economic dynamics clearly.
So with your knowledge, can you tell me what went wrong? What were the main mistakes that kept nations like Bangladesh from developing more quickly? I mean, we have a model that was extremely successful, the Chinese one, right? The Chinese lifted 300-400 million people out of poverty in a span of 30 years.
Yeah, more than that, actually, probably 600 million or more.
More than half a billion. I mean, most fantastic development success in the history of humanity, right? And other nations didn't. So if you look at, like, let's take Bangladesh, or let's take like a large part of sub-Saharan Africa, that it's not the same. They are not the same today anymore as they were in the past. But if in comparison to what China achieved, it went much slower. Can you tell me what should have been done differently, let's say in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, or what should have happened differently? I'm not saying these countries didn't have agency. They were struggling with a ton of political issues, being still dominated by their former colonial overlords. But what should have happened in order to make that kind of Chinese model of development possible?
Indeed, excellent question. I wish we had more time to discuss this at length, but briefly, we can start with Marx's famous observation in his 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. He says that human beings make history, I'm paraphrasing him, but not as they like, because they have to make it under given circumstances. So there is agency, but it's not perfect by any means. Now let's fast forward to First World War, which of course, there were already these movements, starting with Chartist movement in England, the first industrialized capitalist country, and then moving on to other countries of Europe. And anti-colonial movements, of course, have a history as well. But the socialist parties in Europe really betrayed the cause of the working people. And the revolution that took place in what became Soviet Union had great promises, but because of a number of factors which we don't have time to review here, it ended up in Stalinism, just to give it a kind of moniker. And that was not democratic. It did provide some security for the people, but ultimately led to this unworkable kind of economic system even, quite leaving aside political issues. So by the time China itself had its revolution, although this was much longer lasting and more poor peasant based and more egalitarian, China also struggled. It went through several, I think, ultra-left kind of moves, including the so-called Great Leap Forward, which ended up in a famine. And then during Cultural Revolution, although there were some, I would say, good aspects where they wanted to follow the model of the Paris Commune and be more democratic, it ultimately degenerated into factional fights and both above and below. And Deng Xiaoping, who was a pragmatic person, decided that China needed to stop all this and modernize. And I think he was at least 50% right in that. And China took advantage of international division of labor by giving up the idea of exporting revolution, if it ever had that, and for some time it did actually, or some part of the party did. And they pragmatically focused on exporting and trying to get as much foreign technology as they could in the process. But it can't be denied that along with improvement in GDP per capita, as well as productivity, China also was forced to exploit more its own peasantry and its own workers. So some of the socialist institutions in China that were developing, that were nascent, had to be sacrificed, or leaders thought that they had to be sacrificed. And it went to the other extreme almost from 1995 onwards. And China became extremely unequal. So while no one can deny Chinese achievements, especially in poverty reduction, etc., China also faces problems of inequality reduction, problem, of course, of environmental policies, and of course, managing its external relations. I do think, however, that there is a progressive part of Chinese society and Chinese party still. So they have lots of problems, but they have to sort it out themselves. What China needs more than anything else right now is peace.
And let's talk about Bangladesh. You wrote a paper about the country's position in the 1970s, being part of the non-aligned movement. How did that go? What are the lessons, and what would you say Bangladesh might be would try non-alignment again now? I would just like to discuss in particular one paragraph that you wrote. I'm going to read this out here in the conclusion. You wrote, by emphasizing peace along with non-alignment in order to create an egalitarian development trajectory for the Global South, Bangabandhu was offering a way for the post-colonial world to move forward together, making the best use of their natural and human resources. This still remains the best strategy for genuine development. Could you explain this and where you see that today?
Sure. Well, actually, of course, the non-aligned movement started in a way in Europe with Yugoslavia, with Tito. And
Indonesia,
moved to India and Indonesia, and then China also thought it was an attractive proposition. And I think that vision of Bandung has been discussed very ably recently by 𝗦𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘆. He is a good historian, and there's a lot of detail, so one can consult him. On the economic side, I think, although, as I mentioned, historically there were many imperfections in finding the right balance between market and state, what part should be planned and what part should be left to initiatives of people. But I think fundamentally the idea that China still is following, that commanding heights of the economy should be under control of popular governments, not multinational corporations from abroad or foreign powers or big business, big private business domestically. That is quite sound. But I think China has shown us that both USSR and China, former USSR China, they showed us that kind of top-down economy, only a state-run economy, cannot be a practical way of developing a society that is ultimately modern and productive, not just of military equipment, but also necessities of the people and for the people. So I think we need that kind of a mix, and we have a better model today. The problem of countries like Bangladesh, first of all, the regime I discussed from 1972 roughly to 1975 had great possibilities, but basically was thwarted by a combination of internal factors and external factors that resulted in assassination, a very brutal assassination of one of the leading lights, and one of the founders of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and almost his entire family. His eldest daughter is now the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, and she survived. She and her sister survived only because they were abroad. In fact, they were in Germany with the husband of Sheikh Hasina, who was a physicist and was in the German town of Karlsruhe, I think. That's how they survived. Otherwise, they would have been killed as well. And since then, we had this kind of neoliberal right-wing turn, politically, socially, economically especially. And that led to a very haphazard kind of development, especially in infrastructure, and also private ownership was accepted uncritically, and a lot of wealth of the country, which is poor to begin with, went abroad, and they still are abroad. So I think Bangladesh had been struggling since 1975, and many mistakes happened even in these 3 years that I described. I point them out in my paper also objectively. But I think on the whole, it was going in the right direction. And since then, even with the restoration of parliamentary democracy, which has been a good thing, I'd say, but it's not the magic bullet, because parliamentary democracy is, after all, a form of democracy. And a lot depends on who are the parliamentarians, which interests in society do they represent, how are they resolved. And I have written on these things at length somewhere else, and other people have as well. And if I have seen a little farther, it's only because I stand literally on the shoulders of giants. So my debt to them cannot be really ever repaid. I think today we have a situation where coming out of the neoliberal period, unipolar period, when US and European Union also basically followed the same path, same prescriptions, and even UNDP at the United Nations. So they were all pushing this neoliberal line, and they were claiming that this would, as you put it so nicely, lead to great industrial, agricultural, and overall development. It really hasn't happened in many places. In fact, it led to crisis in many parts of the global south, starting with Central and South America, starting with Mexico, the so-called debt crisis of 1980s, which gave these organizations and northern states to push even further their neoliberal program. But now I think there is an opening with this BRICS, the multipolar world that is developing. And to go back to your original question, I think it is a major shift. It could be derailed, but I don't think it's going to go down without a serious struggle. And I think there is a good chance that the multipolar system might prevail, but if the US forces a war between itself and China, of course, its real preference is to have a war between China and the East Asian countries. Witness the rearming of Japan. And you point out very nicely the contradictions between Article 9 of Japan and the new security strategy, which of course has many different interpretations, from a very hawkish one to a very defense-oriented one. Ultimately, it would be the politics inside the countries and regionally, and between the US, Europe, and other regions of the world that will determine which way countries like Japan will go. And then there will always be people who can interpret the documents accordingly.
But so do you think that in a more multipolar world, is it going to be a world of more free trade or of more protectionism, or is the differentiation wrong? I mean, let's take Bangladesh again. If we have a truly multipolar world where India, China, Russia, the United States, maybe Japan, like are the big trading powers. Will Bangladesh be able to try to grow out of being just the world's sweatshop and develop other industries? Or will that be more complicated because all the others will say, like, you're not going to do that, you just make T-shirts?
I think the latter, of course, is preferable, where you have overall articulation of the economy, as we call it. So you don't stay limited just to agricultural crops or worse yet, cash crops, and in industry, just garment or some light manufacturing of industry. On the other hand, I think small countries are at a disadvantage always because they're starting from a very small base, and because of colonialism again and class oppression, a poorly articulated or disarticulated economy where there is no balance between different sectors. Coming back to the trade question, I think openness to some extent, of course, is welcome if it is not too asymmetric. Every country that has developed, other than maybe England, even England had restrictions about wool manufacture, and it also stole technology from Netherlands, especially, and enticed Dutch skilled workers to migrate to England. And then it didn't allow them to migrate anywhere else from England once they were there. So they're because of the unevenness in the world, you need some kind of infant industry protection for some time. But we have to think also in terms of dynamic comparative advantage, because you cannot allow the infant to be infant forever. Infant has to grow up. And here I think East Asian experience, as well as early German experience, but in Asia, maybe East Asian experience is more relevant. The way Japan developed, the way Korea, Taiwan, and most recently China developed. The exceptions are city-states like Hong Kong, Singapore. But even there, they provided public housing to low-income people and other facilities, including healthcare facilities and what we might call social wage. So those are things that we also have to take into account. Human beings cannot be productive if they don't have good health, if they don't have good education, training facilities, etc., etc. So I think we have to have all of them in mind. And Professor 𝗷𝗂𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁𝘁 came up with the famous idea of capabilities, which goes actually back to, in the Western tradition, certainly to Adam Smith. And also you can take it all the way to Aristotle and his idea of eudaimonia, the human flourishing, which requires some material preconditions as well as spiritual and political preconditions, as we know.
Maybe toward the end of our interview, let me ask you about Pakistan. Pakistan is going through a crisis, I think, as big as never before. It's at the brink of civil war. Where do you see the situation for that country going in East Asia?
Pakistan was a problematic country right from the beginning, and that was shown when East Pakistan felt the need to separate from Pakistan. But even in its present form, Pakistan has many different ethnic groups, many different linguistic groups, dominated by basically business people, very rich business people, in collusion with the military, the upper echelons of the military. And certainly two areas of Pakistan have always felt very oppressed and unjustly treated. One is Balochistan. The other one is northwest frontier province in WFP. And they have been centers of a lot of dissident activities, including rebellions from time to time. I think one factor that people from ruling classes have used to keep Pakistan together is the fear of India and religiosity, using religion as an ideology. That was used in East Pakistan too, but in the 1960s, it worked less and less until it didn't work at all. In West Pakistan, I do not know, or I cannot say with confidence what would happen, because right now, the main oppositional force to military led by the ex-cricketer Imran Khan, who seems to be a very decent fellow in so many ways. And of course, as a cricket fan, I'm a fan of that Imran Khan, certainly. But he is trying to use a version of Islam. It looks, I have not studied it closely, but it looks to me like a more progressive, justice-oriented form of Islam, which did exist actually in the history of Islam. But it went out of the window even in the early history of Islam, as soon as Islam actually became an ideology of an empire, from roughly about 680 AD. And then when Baghdad was destroyed in 1258 by the Mongols, it shifted to what today is Turkey. But at that time, at first was the Seljuk Turk Empire and then Ottoman Turk Empire. So Islam's extended history does not offer me, at least, much hope that it can become the kind of original democratic or at least associational kind of political system that seemed to have existed. In any case, that existed in a very different type of social formation historically. So I think Pakistan will face a lot of political and other types of crises, unfortunately, and there may well be even more violence, looking into the near future. But I wish those people well. I speak some of their languages, and there are great people, very progressive people in Pakistan. There always have been. I devoted actually one chapter in my recent book that I mentioned on those progressive people from what is today's Pakistan. And so I hope that they can form a kind of political movement and coalition that would lead towards a more just social formation. I don't think creating more countries will actually lead to the solution. That's no magic bullet either. And it's a sign of desperation always. You have to do a lot of other things, as I discuss in my paper on Bangladesh that you mentioned, and I have written other more specific papers dealing with specific issues, including issue of poverty and inequality. But first of all, Pakistan really needs to have a civilian accountable government. And without that, you could give money, you could facilitate trade, and it might actually even contribute to GDP growth. It may increase the GDP, however modestly, but the fruits of that growth will not really go down very far below the top layer of the society. And then this group basically transfers wealth from within Pakistan to other places that are safer for them. Whenever they have trouble, they actually make for the exit. And they are, in that sense, they are globalized. They are internationally connected. So I think Pakistan needs an accountable government. It doesn't have to be a perfect one, but it has to be accountable to the people. And will have to be some leaders who have some sense of responsibility to the country, to the people, to some modicum of justice. After that, Pakistan has a lot of good economists. Many of them are actually abroad. Some have studied in the same schools that people like me have studied. And they have many good ideas, including ideas for what kind of exports to promote and how to improve the balance of trade and the balance of payments, how to follow a more balanced kind of development path. So Pakistan really does not lack for brain power at that level. I think what it needs is some modicum of political will.
Okay, and now toward the end, you told me that you would like to end the interview with a sonata, actually, on an anti-war sonata. So, Haider, may I ask you to give us your sonata?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You remember everything. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I wrote this poem actually during an actual war. So it's not an exercise in abstract poetry or abstract expressionism. Okay, it's called.
When did you write it? Like, give me the background.
I wrote it during
Bangladesh?
the Gulf War, an invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But sadly, its relevance is still there, and I think of the tragic war in Ukraine today when I read this poem anywhere. So here it is. Like a sonata, it has 3 parts. First part, an invitation to be a part of war. The face of the other, half hidden, half revealed, like the moon in the mist, only the dark side, forever invisible. The invocation, at last, of the beast within the own. Part 2. The conjurers of war build monuments of burnt landscapes. Their war is death inscribed in finely embroidered phrases. The violence of the rotten sun scatters skulls, skeletons, radiates macabre fantasies on a landscape lacerated. Death dance in euphoria mask the urgency of a transgression that reason can no longer constrain. The dark abyss, their eyes cannot see. There is no moon tonight, only desolate dreams, unreal nocturne. And part 3, the finale. A clutching at the roots, outside, voices awakening, strip away the concealment of words and gestures of denial. War is the ultimate pornography of the body and the mind. So much must be laid bare, just so we can once again speak in our own tongues, just so we can once again turn to the sun without violence, just so one lone bird can sing once again on one snow-covered branch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will have to think about this one. I'm not somebody who can easily understand poems, but I am sure there's a lot of people to who this speaks. My eternal question will be why we do these wars. They are so irrational. I keep thinking, as if we are alone, humans, we get lonely very quickly. And as soon as you put us into a bigger group of people, we start fighting. And if the groups become very big, we start war. But at the end of the day, nobody wants to be alone. So how do we make sense of this? I'll keep asking, and I'll keep asking you again, I hope in the near future. Haider, thank you very much for taking the time today.
You're most welcome. I think this is the kind of togetherness that we need to move towards. Open communication, as one German philosopher, 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁𝘁 says, undominated discourse. And true human brotherhood and sisterhood, as Schiller's famous poem, which Beethoven immortalized even further. I think those messages are very important for us to remember.
And we will talk about them again. Thank you very much, Haider A
We
Khan,
shall.
for
Thank you.
today.
Thank you very much.